Welcome to the 21st video in this video series on building an e-commerce website using React, Redux, GraphQL, and Firebase. In today's video, we're going to be working on our order history. So let's take a look at how this works. And I've already added a few items to my cart, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on my cart. As you can see, I can make some changes to it, but I'm more or less happy, so I'm going to go ahead and click on checkout. Okay, so I've skipped ahead. I've entered in my shipping and billing information. I'm going to go ahead and enter my card number. Again, I'm using Stripe's payments API, but also I'm using a test API, so I can just put in my test card number and click on pay. I'm then going to be taken to my order history page. I can see previous orders that I've made, and I can click on either one of them. When I do, I'm taken to my order details page, where I can view both not only the order ID, my order number, I can view the total amount, I can view the individual products that I purchased, the price and quantity of each of those items as well. Before we get started, I want to encourage you guys to check out my official YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/SimpleTut. Not only to watch my other videos, but also to find the official playlist for this series. I'll be posting a direct link to this in the description of this video, but I also want to send you guys to the official GitHub repository for this project. Again, there'll be a link in the description of the video. But as always, please like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on those notifications. We're going to be using Redux to handle our order history. So there's a few new files that we need to create in our Redux folder. I'm going to store these in a folder called orders. And the files I need to create are going to be orders.types.js. We need orders.actions.js, orders.reducer.js, orders.sagas.js, and finally our helpers, so orders.helpers.js. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define the types that we're going to be using. So thinking ahead, we need 3 new types. But before I tell you what those are, we need to create a const to store them in. So we'll say const orders types is going to equal an object. We need to remember to export that. So we're going to export our order types. Now the types that we need to create, first of all, is going to be save order history start. Right? And the value of that is going to be the same as the name of the key. We're going to use this, we're going to dispatch this to actually save our order history, to save our new order to the collection on our Firestore. We need another one to get user order history, right? And we're going to say start. And again, the value is going to be the same as the name assigned to the key. And then finally, we need another one to set user order history. And we're going to use this when we've actually fetched a user's order history. And we're going to use that to actually set that data in our Redux store. The next thing that we need to do is create our actions. So I'm going to come into my orders actions file, and we're going to import our types. So this is orders types from our types file, so orders.js. And then we need to create those corresponding actions. And the first one is going to be our save action. So I'm going to export const, I'm going to call this save order history, and it's just going to take an order, and then it's going to return a object with a type. The type is going to be order types dot save order history start, and the payload is going to be the order. And then we need to create another action to get a user's order history. So again, we're going to export const get user order history. It's going to take a UID of the user. And again, it's going to have a type and payload. So the type is going to be orders types dot get user order history start, and the payload is going to be the UID. And then finally, we need another one to set the history in the Redux store. So we're going to export const set user order history, and again, that's going to take some history, and then it's going to return an object with a type and payload. The type is going to be order types dot set user order history, and the payload is going to be the history, and I'm going to save those changes. Now that we've written our actions, we're ready to actually create our sagas. So let's come into our orders.sagas, and we're going to use this to actually handle our async code. This is when we are actually going to either set or fetch data from our Firestore and then pass that into our Redux store. So to do that, we need to import, first of all, our types. So I'm going to say import orders types. We're going to import that from our types file. So it's going to be orders.types. We're also going to need to import some things from Redux Saga itself. So we'll say Redux Saga here /effects. And the effects that we're going to need to import are going to be take latest, put, all, and call. All right, so we're now ready to write those generator functions and our sagas. So what we're going to do is we'll say export function, and as it's a generator function, we need to put an asterisk after the function keyword, and then we can actually just say this is the name of our generator function. And of course, within Redux Saga, we have this naming convention of using the on prefix, right? So it's going to be on save order history start, right? And what we're going to do here is we're going to yield take latest, right? And this expects two things. First of all, the type that we want to listen and intercept, right, within our Redux store. So we'll say order types dot save order history, because that's the action that we want to intercept. And then we need to pass the name of the generator function we'll use to handle this this event. So we need to create that. So we're going to say export function. Again, it's a generator function. We're just going to call this save order. It's going to receive the entire action, right? So that includes the payload, which we're going to destructure. And in this case, that's going to contain the order. And we're going to handle that within these braces here, right? But we're going to come back to that. For now, it's going to be enough for us just to pass that in to take latest, right? So that's actually the boilerplate code done, but we do need to export this at the bottom of the file, and then we need to pass that to our root Saga so that our Redux store is actually aware of this file, because it is a new file. So to do that, we need to export this at the bottom of the file. So we're going to export default function, which is, again, it's a generator function. We're going to call this our orders sagas. And what we're going to do is we're going to call yield all. We're going to pass in an array where we're going to call those initial generator functions, right? So the one that we created here, which is on save order history start, we're going to pass that in here, and we're going to save those changes. And let's just add in a line break at the bottom of the file. And then what we can do is we can come over to our root Saga, and what we can do is just import that file, right? So we're going to say it's our orders sagas. We're going to import that from the file itself. So we'll just go into orders/orders sagas. And then here we can pass that in, right? So we'll say call our orders sagas, and we can save that. And that's just making it's going to pass it to our Redux store, and it's going to make our Redux store aware of these sagas. So it's going to be able to intercept this action every single time that it gets dispatched. Okay, so we're now ready to write out our save order generator function. This is where we're going to actually handle our async code. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this within a try catch. So we'll say try, we're going to catch any errors, right? And then what we can do here, if we get an error, is we can just, console log the error, or we could pass that back to the front end. But for now, I'm just going to comment that out. And here what we really want to do is we want to perform this action, right? So I'm actually going to use a helper function, which I'm going to define here. So let's come into our orders.helpers file. And first of all, we need to import a util that we created at the start of this series, which I'm exporting from Firebase /utils, which is our Firestore, right? So if I come into this file, again, we created this in one of the first videos in this series. And one of the things I'm doing in this file is I'm exporting the Firestore, right? So that's just a helpful util. We've used it already in a number of places, and we're using it again here. You'll see how in just a second. Now we're going to export this helper function. So we're going to say export const handle save order, right? And this, again, it's just going to take an order, and then it's going to, what it's going to do is it's going to return a new promise, right? And as it's a promise, we're going to get resolve, and we're going to get reject. And then what we can do here is we can call Firestore, and we can chain on a bunch of methods here, right? So the first one is going to be our collection. So we're going to target our orders collection. And of course, if our orders collection doesn't exist, it's going to create it. If it does exist, we're going to just use that collection. And then we're going to create a new document. So we're going to say doc. And then we're going to call this set method. And we're just going to set the order, right? And what that will then allow us to do is call the then method, right? We'll say then. And if this is successful, we're going to resolve this promise, which means it was successful. However, if we catch an error, what we're going to do is we're going to get the error, right? And we're going to call reject, and we're going to pass the error back to the front end, right? So now that we've defined our helper function, we can come back over to our Saga, and we're going to import that helper function. So we'll import that helper. So we'll import that from orders.helpers. We need to import handle save order. And then we can yield that, right? So we can call yield handle save order, call that, and I'm going to pass in an object here, and I'm going to use the spread operator to pass in the object here for our payload. Now the reason that I'm passing this using the spread operator is because I want to add a few, I need to add some additional data here. So the first thing is the order user ID, right? So this is going to be the ID of the user that has created this order. So to get that, we need to import something. We need to import something from, again, our Firebase utility file. So Firebase utils, which is auth, right? So what we can actually do is we can call auth dot current user dot UID, and this will just allow us to fetch individual users' order history, because otherwise there would be no way to associate an order with an individual user, which is something that we will need to do. And then finally, we'll need a way of ordering this on the front end. So I'm going to add on here order created date, right? And just above this here, I'm going to create a const called timestamp, right? And I'm just going to say new date dot to date string, and I'm then going to pass that in here as well. Okay, so at this point we are ready to actually save orders. So we can actually go to the front end and dispatch this action. So to do that, let's come over to our components folder, and we need to find our payment details component, which is here. And as you can see right now, what we're doing is we are, once a payment has been successful, we're dispatching our clear cart action, which we're using to empty the user's cart because they've now checked out. And then we're redirecting them away, I believe, to the home page. Now what we want to do is we want to dispatch a new action, which is our save order history, so that once a user has successfully processed a payment and checked out, we're going to save that to their order history. And we need to dispatch that here, right? So let's delete this. And what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to come up to the top and I'm going to import the action we just created. So we need to import that from our Redux folder. So it's Redux / orders / our orders actions, and it is our save order history action, right? So what we can do is we can then come down, right? And first of all, we need to find our code here. There we go. So where we were previously dispatching ClearCart, we now want to dispatch our new action, which is save order history, right? But as you'll know, this expects an order, right? We need to pass an order, which is the object we want to save to our collection. So I'm going to build that object. So I'm going to say const config order, right? And what I'm going to do first of all is I want to specify the order total, right? So I'm going to say order total, and that is going to equal total. So we already have access to this. We're getting that here from our use selector hook. We're getting that, we have our custom selector here. So that's fine. Now I also want to pass in the order items, right? Because usually when you look at order history, you can see the order total and you can see the items that were purchased within the order. So we're going to say here order items, right? Now unfortunately, we don't currently have access to the order items or the cart items within this component. So we're going to import another selector that we wrote in a previous tutorial, which is select cart items, right? And then within create structured selector here in our map state function, what we're going to do is we're going to add in cart items, right? And pass it our select cart items selector here. Let's save that. We also need to then get access to that. We can do that here where we call our use selector hook to get access to our cart items. But of course, our cart items, right, we don't want to just pass in our cart items, because unfortunately this contains a lot of data that really is unnecessary. We don't need to store all of that data. We only need a few fields of it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the map function on cart items. We're going to get the item, right? And then what we want to do is destructure the fields we want from the item, right? So we'll call destructure from item. And the first thing we want is the document ID, right? We want the product thumbnail. We want the product name. We'll get the product price and the quantity. Okay, so once we have that, we're then going to return only those fields. So again, the document ID, the product thumbnail, the product name, the product price, and the quantity, right? Let's save those changes. And then where we dispatch our save order history action, we're just going to pass in our config order, right? So that looks much better. But of course, at the moment, once this has been dispatched, let's look at what's happening here. If I come up a little bit, you'll see we have this use effect hook, right? Which is checking the item count is less than 1, which means that basically their cart has been cleared. And then we were redirecting them to the home page. Now what we want to do is we actually want to redirect them to their order history, which I can tell you now is going to be our dashboard. So I'm just going to now change this to be redirecting users to our dashboard, right? But unfortunately, previously we were dispatching our clear cart action within this component, right? But now we are dispatching our save order history action. So we are no longer clearing the cart after a user has successfully checked out. So what we're going to do is we're actually now going to dispatch that action from our Saga, right? So once we have saved a user's order history successfully, we're going to dispatch our clear cart action. So to do that, we're going to import that action in this file. So to do that, we'll come out of this folder, we'll go into cart and our cart actions. We want to import our clear cart action, and then all we have to do is call yield put and just dispatch clear cart. Okay, so we're almost ready to test this in the browser. I just want to make a small refactor here. So on my orders Saga, when I create my timestamp, I shouldn't actually be creating a string here. We do want this to be a normal timestamp. So I'm just going to make that small change, save that, and we're now ready to test this in the browser. So I've gone ahead and I've added a few items to my cart. I've clicked through to my checkout page, and I've already entered my shipping and billing information. I'm going to go ahead and enter my card details. Again, I'm using the Stripe Development API keys, so I can actually just enter a test card here. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on Pay Now. And what you should see is I'm going to get redirected to my dashboard. And as you can see, if I come into my Firestore, and as you can see, I now have my orders collection with an order. And as you can see all the information about the order that we created, right? So we have our created date, which is our timestamp. We have our order items. Okay, so at this point, we're ready to actually fetch this on the front end so that we can actually show a user's order history in the browser. Okay, so we want to actually show a user's order history on their dashboard within their account, which is going to be on this page. But of course, we can only do that if we go out and fetch the data first. So we need to make a start by actually coming back over to our text editor. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to close all the other files because the file that we want to start off with is our sagas. So earlier in the tutorial, we already created our action, which is our get user order history action. We're also going to use our set user order history. But we need to first of all just go ahead and create our sagas, right? So I'm just going to scroll down the file here, or maybe I'll do it at the top. add in a few line breaks to make it a bit easier to follow. But what we're going to create, first of all, we're going to create export function. It's a generator function. And we're going to call this on get user order history start, right? And just like before, right? So we're going to call yield take latest. It's going to take the type that we want to intercept. So this is going to be get user order history start. And again, we need to pass in the name of the generator function that's going to handle this async code. So we're going to say export function, generator function. We're just going to call this get user order history. This is going to, we're going to destructure the payload, and then we're going to be able to handle that logic within these braces, right? But we're going to need to first of all pass this into take latest, but we're also going to need to export this at the bottom of the file. So we're going to export on get user order history start. We're going to export that here so that we're going to pass this on to our root Saga. So here we'll just pass that in, and that means that we're passing this to our root Saga, and that is going to pass it to our Redux store so that it starts listening for this this action when it gets dispatched, so it can intercept it, and it can call this generator function, which is where we're going to call our try catch and handle our async code. So again, we're going to have another try catch here. We're going to catch any errors, and again, for now, I'll just console log out the error, but I'm going to comment that out for now. But what we need to do here is we need to actually call another helper function that's actually going to be the one responsible for fetching a user's order history from the store. The only thing that's important to be aware of here is what this payload actually is going to contain. So if you look at the action here that's getting dispatched, which is this one, the payload is actually equal to the user's UID. So we're passing in the user's user ID here, and we're going to pass that to a helper function. We haven't written the helper function yet. We're going to need to do that now. So what we'll do is underneath this, what we'll do is we'll say export const handle get user order history. It's going to get a user's UID, and then again, what we're going to do is we're going to return a new promise, right? And that is going to get resolve and reject. And we already have access to our Firestore, and I misspelled return here. Now we already have access to Firestore, but we're going to do this a little bit differently, right? So what I'm actually going to do, I'll just scroll a little bit here, create a few lines space. I'm going to store a reference to my Firestore collection in a variable, which I'm going to assign to let. So what I'll do here is I'll say let ref equals Firestore. We're going to target the collection, our orders collection. So we'll say orders. And we also want to chain on order by. And if I come back over here to my Sagas and I look at my save order generator function here, you'll see that we have order created date. And this is what we want to order our order history on, right? But what we're going to do here is we're going to add on a condition right here. So we're going to say ref equals our ref dot where, and what we want to do is we want to filter the collection, right? But we only want to get the order history of a particular user. So again, if we reference our Saga, we have our order user ID that we can use because that contains the user's UID. so we can compare these two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say where the order user ID, right, is equal to the UID that we are passing into our helper function. Okay, so what we can now do is fairly straightforward. We can just call the ref, and we can just chain on here .get. That's going to get a snapshot. We can then say .then, right? Call then, and again that's going to get our snapshot. So we'll just say snapshot. We'll just call it snap. And then what I want to do here is it's only going to contain a reference document, right? So we need to get that. So I'm going to store that in a const. I'm going to call this data. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll use the spread operator. We're going to call snap.docs.map, right? We're going to get the individual document. We're going to return an object. Again, we're going to use the spread operator, right? And we're going to call doc.data. We're going to call that method, and that's going to get the data on the document, but it's not going to return the document ID, which we are going to need for our order details page. So we're going to add in our document ID, right? Which is going to equal the doc.id. And then what I'm going to be able to do here is I'm going to resolve this, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in data. Now, if there was an error, just like before, what we can do is we can say .catch. We can get the error, and we can call reject and pass it the error. But that's actually all we need to do for our helper function here to get a user's order history. I'm just going to add a semicolon there and a line break at the end of the file. So we can now come back over to our Saga. We can assign this to a variable. I'm going to say const history here. It's going to equal yield. We're going to yield and await the response from our helper function here, which we need to import. So up here where we import our helper here for handle save order, we're also going to import our helper function for handle get user order history. So we can call that here. And all we need to do is pass in our payload, which is our user's UID, right? And then once we have that, assuming that it's successful, because if it wasn't, it would fall into the catch. So as long as it hits this line, we know it's been successful. What we can do is we can dispatch another action, right? Which is to set our history in our Redux store. So at the moment, we're not importing it, but we do have another action here, which is set user order history. So we need to import that from our actions file. So we're going to import from our orders actions, and we're going to import set user order history. So we'll call yield put, and we will dispatch our action, and we'll pass it our history, which if we look at the action is exactly what this expects. Okay, so at this point we're fetching our user's order history and we're dispatching an action to actually set that in our Redux store. But we don't have a reducer currently set up to actually handle this action. So we need to come over to our orders reducer.js, and the first thing we'll do is just import our types. So we'll say orders types. We want to import that from our types file here. And we need to create our reducer. So let's do the boilerplate code. So we'll say const orders reducer. It's going to equal a function, right? That's going to take some state. We're going to, by default, pass it some initial state, which we haven't defined. So we'll say const initial state. and we're going to pass that here by default. And it's also going to receive an action. And the initial state is just going to have some order history, which is by default just going to be an empty array. Now this is going to be a switch function, so it'll be a switch. We're going to pass the switch function the action.type, right? And it's going to have a default case where we just return the state. And we need to remember to export this by default at the bottom of the file. So we'll say export orders reducer. And then we just need to define our case here. So we'll have case orders types dot set user order history, where we will return the state, but we will set the order history to be the action dot payload. Just like we did with our Saga, we need to pass our reducer to our root reducer. So let's come over to our root reducer here, and we need to import that file. So we'll say import our orders reducer. We want to import that from the file, so it's /orders/ our orders reducer. And then here we'll just say our orders data and pass it our orders reducer. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to utilize the actions that we just created so that we can actually fetch a user's order history and then pass that into a component that can consume the data and render out the user's order history within the UI. So to do that, let's come back over to our code editor, and we want to go into our source and pages and our dashboard index.js. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to import the use effect React hook. We also need to import some things from React Redux, which will allow us to dispatch our action and also get data from our Redux store. So we'll need use dispatch and use selector. And we also need the action that we just created. So we'll import that from our Redux folder. So we'll go into Redux /orders actions. And the action we need is the get user order history action. And then what we need to do is first of all get access to dispatch. So we'll say const dispatch equals use dispatch and call that hook. And then what we'll do is we'll call the use effect hook here, which of course takes a function and a dependency array. The dependency array is going to be empty because we only want to run this on the initial page load when this component mounts. So all we're going to do here is actually just dispatch our action to go out and fetch our user's order history. But as you know, this expects the user's user ID, right? That's how we get only a specific user's order history. So we need to get the current user from our Redux store. We have that already in our Redux store. So we'll define map state, right? Which is we're going to destructure the user from our Redux store here. And what we want to get is the current user. We'll get that from user.current user. And then what we can do here is we can call our use selector hook and pass in our map state here. And what we'll do is we will get our current user, and then we will pass that in here with the ID of the user, right? So at this point, we are successfully fetching the user's order history, and we are adding that into our Redux store. Okay, so at this point, we have successfully dispatched the action to go out and fetch a user's order history from Firebase. and then store that within our Redux store. But what I want to do is I just want to come over to the browser and show you that currently, if you visit your dashboard, which is where we dispatch our action, you're going to see that we are not seeing our order history. All right, so our Redux store is actually still empty. But there's no errors here. We're not really seeing anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to my code editor. I'm going to come over to my orders Saga. And within the generator function for get user order history, I'm going to uncomment out the error, right? So we're now logging the console error within the try catch. I'll come back over to the browser, right? And I'm going to navigate back to my account page. And you're going to see that the error we're getting is that it actually is telling us we need to create a new index within our Firebase database, right? Now, the reason we need to create an index is because if we look at our helper function, we're performing an order by, and we are also calling the where method, right? Now, to perform a more complex query like this, we're going to need to create a new index. Now, this is something we've also done before when we were looking at our product results pages. But on this occasion, all we have to do is simply click the link that Firebase provides for us. If I go ahead and click that, it's going to prompt me to create a new index. All I have to do is select Create Index. And although it is going to take a little bit of time, it is going to create the index for me. And at the moment you can see it says it's building. But once this switches to enabled, this will be ready to go. And we'll be able to test this again in the browser, and we should start seeing results. Okay, so you can now see that this is enabled. So if I come back over to the web browser, you'll see that in my Redux store, I now have already gone out and fetched the user's order history, and this is the order that we created moments ago. What we're now going to do is we're going to consume that data on the front end, right? So we're going to build a component that can actually take the user's order history and then render that out. As you can see here, I'm going to be using Material UI. This is a really cool UI library from Google. I'm quite sure you will have heard of it, but we are going to need to install this. What we're going to be using is some of the pre-built components that they provide for creating really nice looking tables, and it just makes it a lot easier for us to use. But it's also something that's useful for you to be aware of for other projects and other areas of even this application. It is very useful. So before we can use it, we need to install it. So I'm going to grab this line here to install it. You can either copy it, you can come to the website yourself, which is material/ui.com, or I'll post a direct link in the description of the video. So let's come back over to our text editor. I'm just going to go to Terminal, New Terminal, and I'm just going to go ahead and install this. So I'll paste in that line and hit return, and that's going to go ahead and install Material UI. Now we are also going to be installing Moment.js. This is another really cool library that we're going to be using to actually render out our date. Right, so with order history, we want to display the order created date, and as you know, we stored that as a timestamp. So to format that correctly on the front end, we're going to use Moment, which is a really cool library just for handling dates and timestamps. So I'm going to grab that as well. So let's come back over to the text editor, and again, I'm going to install Moment. So npm install Moment. Okay, so at this point, we're ready to actually go ahead and create our order history component. This is the component that's going to consume the data from our Redux store and then render out the user's order history in the browser. So the first thing that we need to do is go into our source folder, components, and we need to create a new file. We're going to call this order history/index.js. Right? Now this is going to be a functional component. So we're going to import React from React. right? It's a functional component, so we'll just say const order history. It's going to receive orders as a prop, and we'll have a return here. We'll come back to that. First of all, let's just export this by default. So we'll export our order history. And what we want to return is actually from Material UI, right? So let's import those components. So we'll import from our library. So it's Material UI core. The components that we need are the table components. So the first one is our table container. Then we need our table. We need a table head and a table row. We need the table body and the table cell, right? So those are the components that we're going to be using. Then what we need to do is just render that out, right? So just imagining how this would flow naturally. So you have your table container with your table inside, right? And then you're going to have your table head, and then below that you're going to have your table body. Within your head, we're going to have a table row. But within our table row, what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, define our columns. So the columns are the fields that we want to display from our data. So we're going to say const columns, right, which is just going to be an array of objects with an ID and a label. The ID is the field that we're getting from the data. So in this case, the first one will be the order created date, and we're going to render this out as the order date. You can actually label this anything you want. The second one will be the order ID, which is actually the document ID. So here we'll say document ID, but the label that will render within the table is going to be the order ID, right? And then finally, we want to display order total, but the label for this will set to be just amount, right? So those are our columns. And what we want to do is we want to map that within our table head and the table row here. So here we're just going to call columns.map, right? We're going to, first of all, we're going to get the column and then the position that we're currently mapping within the array. And then we'll have an explicit return where we call a table cell. Sorry, not table container, table cell component. And what we want to render here is actually, well, it's from column. So here what we'll do is we're going to get the column. So we'll say const will destructure from column, right? And what we want to get is the label, right? And we're just going to render that here. But we need to pass some props here. So the first one is going to be the key because we are mapping and this is React. So we'll use the position there. And then we also want to pass the styles. Now we haven't defined styles, but this is an object that we're going to pass to the various components that we're going to use from Material UI. So these are just some basic configuration. You can review the documentation yourself and set this as you wish, but I'm going to set the font size to 16 pixels. I'm going to set the cursor to be pointer, and I'm going to set the width, which is probably the most important one. I'm going to set that to 10%. And then I'm just going to pass that into the table cell using the styles prop, right? So that's our head done here. Okay, so I'm finally ready to build out my table body. But before I can actually map my orders, I need to verify that we actually have them. So to do that, I'm going to call array dot isArray and pass it the orders. Once we have done that, we'll be able to safely call orders.length because we know it's an array, and we can check that it is greater than 0, which means that we have orders. Once we've done that, what I can do is I can go ahead and map orders. So I'll say orders.map, and what I'm going to get here is the row, right? As I map the orders, I'm going to map my rows, and I'm going to get the position that we're currently mapping, right? And then I'm going to have an explicit return here. And what we're going to return is actually going to be a table row. And what we'll need to do here is pass it the key, which again is the position. Now keep in mind that I'm now mapping the row, right? Now what I actually want to do is very similar to what we did in our table head. I need to map the columns array to get the data, the value from my row, right? So if that doesn't make sense right now, then just bear with me. But what I'm actually going to do is copy the code that we put in the head of our table, because we have to do something very similar here. So I'm just going to copy that in here, but I am going to have to modify it slightly. So rather than destructure label from column, I'm going to store this in a variable. I'm going to call this column name, right? And this is just going to equal the column dot ID, and then we need the value. So to get that, we're going to say column, right, value is going to equal the row which we're currently mapping from our data, but we only want a specific field from our data, which is going to be the field we're currently mapping on the columns array. So I have that in column name. I'll pass that here, and that's going to give me the value from the data that we're currently mapping. So in other words, what we're doing is we have columns. When we map our order created date, which is the first field we want to render within the table, we're basically going to call that here, right? That's how we get it. However, we can't just go ahead and render the value within the table cell, because that would actually throw an error. The reason is we have a bunch of different data types stored within our collection, right? So we have a timestamp, for example, which we can't just render here because it would be invalid. So we actually need a way of formatting the text. So up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function. So I'll just say const format text, right? What it's going to do is it's going to take two things. It's going to take the column name and the column value, right? And it's going to be a switch function, right? It's going to take the column name and it's going to have a default case which will just return the column value here. But we are going to have two cases where we want to change the value, right, for very specific fields. So the first case is our order total, right? So we'll do that by saying that for the case that we are mapping our order total, which is here, we're going to return a string. But what we want to do is we want to prefix this with the pound symbol. So we're going to prefix it like this, and we'll just pass in the column value, right? And this is just going to allow us to pre-append the pound symbol here. I'm also going to have another case, which is where we are mapping our order created date. Now the reason that this is important is because this is going to be the type of, this is going to be a timestamp, right? So when we return this, we actually need to return something, we're going to need to use a library here. So what I'm going to import here is moment. We're going to import that at the top of the file from moment. We installed that just a little bit earlier. And what that will allow me to do here when I return it is I'm going to call moment. I'm going to pass it the column value, and the format that I want to return this in, right, is going to be whatever format that you like. Here I'm going to specify DD, the day, the month, and the year. That's the format I want to return that. Okay, so now I have my format function. And by the way, if it isn't the order total or the order created date, we're just returning the value because that is fine, right? So in this case, the document ID, it isn't going to get caught here, so it's just going to return that. And that's fine because it's just a string. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, then please just bear with me. But here we're going to create another const here, and we're going to call this the formatted text. It's going to equal format, the format text function that we created here, right? And all we're going to do is just pass in the column name and the column value. And then we're going to render the formatted text here. Okay, so once we've done that, let's come over to our page component for our dashboard. And the first thing we need to do is import our order history component. So we'll import order history component from the components folder. So we'll go into components/order history, and we're just going to render this component. So instead of returning a h1 here, let's return a div. With we'll have a h1 inside of that. We'll just call this order history, right? And underneath that, we will render our component. We need to pass it our orders, which we don't have access to yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to import our orders data. We're going to destructure that from the state from a Redux store. We're going to get our order history. Right, and we get that from orders data dot order history dot data, and then we can destructure that here. So we'll get our order history, and we can just pass that into the component using the order. It's actually orders prop. So let's save that. Okay, so as you can see, we're successfully rendering our user's order history within the browser, using our table from Material UI. But I can spot two small bugs, right? So the first bug is that our styles are not being inherited because the text is too small. And the other problem is that we have an invalid date, right? So we need to fix those two bugs. So we're just going to come back over to the text editor and our order history component. To fix the date, we just have to, well, we pass in our column value here, right, to moment. We have to just tag on nano, right? Because this is actually an object. We just need to pass in the nanoseconds. And then further down for styles, the prop is not styles, it's just style, right? So I made a mistake with the prop name. If I change that on both the table cell components in the body and the head, I can come back over to the browser. And if I come back over to my account, you'll see that our table is now displaying correctly. At this point, we are successfully rendering our order history, but we're only displaying our order date, order ID, and amount. There's currently no way of showing the user the order details, which is what we now need to work on next. What should happen is the user should be able to click on one of these orders and take the user to another page where they can view their own that order's details, view the items that were purchased, the amount, and the individual prices of each item. So to do that, we need to come back over to our text editor. And what we need to do is, I'm just going to go ahead and close these two files here and come back over to our Redux files. We need to write out some more code here. And the first thing is our orders types. We need two new types. The first is going to be get order details start. So we'll say get order details start. Again, the value is going to be the same as the name of the key. And then secondly, it's going to be set order details. And again, the value is going to be the same as the name of the key. Now that we've created our types, we need to create the corresponding actions for those types. So what we'll do, we'll come over to our actions file, so orders.actions. We'll say export const get order details start. It's going to take an order ID, and then it's going to be a simple action with a type and payload. So we'll say the type is going to be orders types dot get order details start, and the payload is just going to be the order ID. And then we'll also need another action to set the details in our Redux store. So we'll say export const set order details. It's going to take an order here, and again, it's just going to return a simple type and payload. So the type will be orders types dot set order details, and the payload will just be the order itself. Okay, so now that we've written out our actions, we need to write our sagas. So I'm going to come over to my sagas file. So this is order.sagas, and I'm going to create a new generator function here. So here we'll say export function. Again, it's a generator function, so we need that asterisk after the function keyword. And then we're going to call this on get order details start, right? We're going to yield take latest. We're going to pass in the type we're listening for, so order types dot get order details start, and then the name of the generator function, we're going to handle this async code within. So we'll say export function. It's a generator function. We'll just call this get order details. It's going to receive the full complete action, including the payload, which we're going to destructure. And within this, we're going to have a try catch, which is going to get an error, which we can log. For now, I'm going to comment that out, right? And we can come back to that, but we will need to pass this into take latest, and we will need to export this at the bottom of the file. So I'll call here I'll say call and pass it the name of the generator function that we've defined, take latest. Okay, so at this point we're ready to write out our helper function that we can use to get an order from our Firestore. So to do that, I'm going to open up my orders helpers because we need to write another helper function. So all we need to do here is just define our helper function. So here I'm just going to say export const handle get order equals a function. So it's just going to get the order ID right? This is going to return a new promise, right? So we're going to get resolve and reject, right? And then all we need to do is call Firestore. We're going to look at the collection, our orders collection. We're going to look for a specific document, which we're going to get by the order ID that was passed in here, right? And then all we have to do is call the get method. And then what we can do, because that returns promise, we can just say then. We'll get the snapshot, right? And then what we can say is if the snap dot exists is true, then we can call resolve, because that means that it exists and we've got the order, right? But we can use a spread operator here. We can pass in the snap dot data. That's going to return the data that's on that snapshot, on that document. But to pass back the document ID, we'll say document ID is going to be the order ID that was originally passed into the helper function. And then all we have to do here, again, is just catch any errors. So here we'll just say catch. We'll get the error if there was one. And we can call reject and throw the error. Okay, so now that we've written our helper function, let's come back over to our Saga. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the order. We're going to store that in a variable. So we'll just say const order. Right? So const order equals yield. And we'll await the response. So where we import our helper functions here, so order helpers, we are going to now import handle get order. And we're going to call that here. Right? But we're going to pass in the payload, which of course is going to be our order ID, right? Now, once we've got that, once we have the order, we need a way of setting it. So you'll remember we also created set order details. So we need to dispatch that. So where we import our order actions here, we also need to get our set order details. And again, here, we're just going to call yield, put, and we're going to dispatch set order details with the order, right? So although this action is going to get dispatched and it's going to pass the order, we haven't set up our reducer to update our store. So I need to come back into my orders reducer, and we're going to create some new initial state, which is going to be order details, right? Which is just going to be an empty object by default. And then we need to create a new case. So this is going to be the new case. We'll specify order types dot set order details, right? We're going to return the state, but we're going to set the order details to be the action dot payload, right? And you can just add a semicolon here. Okay, all we need to do now is create our order details page. So I'm just going to go ahead and close these files so it's a little bit easier to navigate. I'm going to come back into my pages component, and I'm going to create a new file here. We're going to call this our order/index.js, right? So this is my new orders page component. For now, let's just import React from React. It's going to be a functional component. We're just going to call this order, right? We don't need to worry about props for now, at least. We're going to have an explicit return. For now, we'll just return a div with a h1. We're going to just pass in the order ID, which we're going to come back to. And then what we can do here is we can just export this component. So we'll just say export default order, and we'll come back to this, but what we want to do is just create the route. So let's go over to our app.js. This is where obviously we configure our routes, and we need to import our new page component. So we'll import order from pages / order. Okay, now we can just define our route. So I'm just going to come down, and just above the admin route here, we're going to create our route. So I'll create a new route here, right? We're going to specify the path, right, which is going to be /order, and then we need a URL param, which we're going to call order ID. We'll then call the render prop here, and we will return our component, which we are going to wrap with auth because the user needs to be signed in to access this route. We want to use the dashboard layout, and the component we obviously want to render is our order component. So let's save those changes. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually dispatch the action to go out and fetch our order, right? So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to import something from React Router DOM, right, which is the use params hook. Okay, so what we can do is we can just call that hook here. So we'll just call that use params here, and that will give us access to our order ID, right? So this is the URL param we defined when we created our route. We're going to use that within the use effect hook. So we'll call use effect here. And we're going to use the use effect hook to dispatch the action we need to fetch the order details. We're not going to pass in anything to our dependency array because we only want this to run when this component is initially mounted. But we are going to need some more things here. So we're going to need, for example, the action we want to dispatch. So to get access to that, we need to go into the Redux folder, orders, and our orders action. We need to import the get order details start. And we also need something from React Redux. So we need to import that. So from React Redux, we need to import use dispatch and use selector. So first of all, we need to get access to dispatch. So here we'll say dispatch equals and call the use dispatch hook. We'll then pass that here to our use effect hook, and we will dispatch our action here with our order ID, right? So this will actually dispatch the action, and it will fetch, and this will fetch the data from our Firebase database. Now, to actually get access to the order details from our Redux store, we need to create our map state function here. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the first of all, we're going to get the order data, right? And then we want the order details, which we can get from order data dot order details. And then all we need to do is use the use selector hook. So we'll say here const, we'll destructure from calling our use selector hook and passing in our map state function, and we can destructure here our order details. Now I can immediately destructure from our order details, right? So I can destructure here the order total, and the reason I want to do that is because at the bottom of the file I want to have a h3 where I pass in the total, which is the order total here. And what I'm also going to do is where I have my order ID here, I'm going to render again from my URL param the order ID here, right? So at this point, I'm able to see that. So at this point, all I'm doing is I'm fetching the order details, and I'm displaying the order ID and the total, right? So let's see how this will work. What we need to do is come back over to our dashboard, right? And we need to link these two pages up. So at the moment, this is my order history component. And within this component, I have my individual fields, right, where I render my initial orders. So on this file, we need to import something from React Router DOM, right, which is use history. And to actually get access to that, what we'll do at the top of the file here, we'll say const history equals use history and call that hook. And then what we can do is where we map our orders, right, what I can do is I can get the document ID from the row. So from the row here, I can destructure the document ID. And the reason we want to do that is here on our table cell, on our table row, right? If I just tab this in a little bit, I can call the onClick event, right? So when someone clicks on an order, we want to call history.push, right? And then we'll push them to orders / the document ID, right? Which is then going to map to the route we defined for our order details, where it expects the order and the order ID. And then when we get the order ID from our URL params in order, we're going to dispatch the action here, passing in our order ID, which then goes out and fetches it and passes it to our Redux store, which we then destructure here, and we can use that within our page and components. So let's kind of see this working in the browser. Okay, so let's test this out in the browser. As you can see, this is our order history. I can now click on this. And as you can see, this is taking me to orders / the order ID. Now this isn't looking like much because I've just realized I entered the wrong URL. So let's just come back over to the text editor. Instead of orders, it should be order. Save that change, right? That's on our order history component. Let's come back over here and let's go back and let's click on our order again. And as you can see, we have an error, right? So let's just check our root reducer here, and you can see this is actually orders data. So if I come back to my my order component, I was getting order data, so it needs to be orders data. Let's save that change, come back to the browser, let's come back over, and as you can see, I'm now getting the order ID and the total amount, which is cool. But what I want to do now is I want to render the order details, right? So I want to render the actual items that were purchased, the amounts, and maybe the thumbnail image and the quantity that was purchased. So let's work on that. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to create our order component, right? So this is going to render out our order details using the same material UI table that we used for our order history component. So again, within my components folder, I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this our order details /index.js, right? Now again, This is going to be a simple functional component. So let's say import React from React. We're going to create a functional component. We're going to call it order details, right? This time it's just going to take in an order, right? And then we're going to have an explicit return, which we're going to come back to in a second. And at the bottom of the file, we just need to remember to export this by default. And at the top of the file, we need to import from material UI core. So we need to import our table container, our table head, our table body, a table row, and our table cell. Okay, so then within order details, where we render this out, we need to render it. So let's render our table container, our table. We need a table head, right? We need, within that, we're going to have a table row. And below our table head, we need a table body, which we're going to come back to, right? Now, just like we did before, we need to create our columns array. So above order details, we're going to create a const called columns, which is going to equal an array of objects with an ID label, with an ID and label. So here we're going to have ID. The first one is going to be our product thumbnail. So we'll say product thumbnail is just going to be an empty string because we don't want to actually have a title for that column. Then we want the product name here, and again the label for this is going to be name. Then we're going to have another ID here. This is another column, so it's going to be product price, and again the label here is just going to be price. We have another column finally, which is for quantity, right? And the label for this is just going to be quantity. Okay, so for our table head, all we need to do is map our columns and render out the labels. So let's go ahead and do that. We're just going to render columns, right? Dot map. We're going to get the col and the position that we're currently mapping in the array. We're going to have an explicit return where we render a table cell, and we're just going to render the label. So we'll just say col.label. We need to specify a key here, so we'll just pass it the position that we're currently mapping. And again, we need that styles array, right? Sorry, styles object. So we'll say const styles equals, it's an object, so we'll set the font size here to 16 pixels, and the width we're going to specify as 10%. We're going to pass styles in here, so it's the style prop right? So we just need to pass that here. And that is our head section done. All we then need to do is we need to destructure from order. So const, we'll just say here const order items equals order dot order items. And then again, let's come down to our table body here. And what we need to do, first of all, is verify that the data is valid. So we'll say array.isArray. We'll pass it our order items. We also want to check that our order items.length is greater than 0. If that is the case, what we can do is we can go ahead and map our order items. So we'll say order items dot map. We're going to get the current row and the position in the array that we're currently mapping. And then we're simply going to return here a table row component. So again, we need to pass the key because this is React, so we'll pass that position. And then just like we did before, we're going to map our columns again. So let's actually copy this code. Let's copy that in, fix our indentation. But what I'm going to do here is, again, I'm going to get the column name. So that's going to equal the col ID. We also need the value. So we'll say column value equals. And again, we're going to map that against the data. So we'll say row column name, right? So we're going to get when we map through our columns, right? So for example, when we map our product thumbnail here, we're going to get the product thumbnail from the row that we're currently mapping from our order items. But like I mentioned before, it's very important that you understand we cannot always render the data types that we will map. So we need to format it. So again, we need to come up to the top of the file here and create our format function. So we'll say const format text equals a function. This is going to take two things. It's going to take the column name and the column value. And then what it's going to do is we're going to have a switch function, which is going to take the column name, right? We're going to have a default case where we just return the column value that's passed in, right? That's our default case. However, if the column name equals the product price, right? Then what we're going to do is, again, we're going to return the product price with the pound symbol prefixed to it. So again, here we can just return the column value. And we also want a custom case for our product thumbnail, right? So here we have our product thumbnail. So if we're currently mapping our product thumbnail, then we want to return a image, right, where we pass the source, which is going to be our column value because that's going to be our source URL. And let's set the width to a hard-coded value of something like 250 pixels or something like that. Okay, so what we can do is we can call format text here, right? Let's come down here. And what we can actually do is when we render this, let's just call format text and pass in our column value here where we go to render it. And then the final thing that we need to do is actually render this component. So don't forget that this component expects the order prop. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back over to our page component. So in pages, we have our order component here. We need to import our order details component. So we'll say order details. We want to import that from our components folder. And our order details. And then we simply need to render that component between our H1 and our H3. We need to pass in our order which we have here. This is our order details. We'll pass that in. Okay, so let's come over and test this again in the web browser. I'm going to go over to my account, click on an order. Okay, and I'm not seeing the orders, so let's just come over and check the code. So my format text function expects both the column name and value. I think, yeah. So I forgot to pass in the column name here to the format text function, right? So let's pass that in. Let's come back over to the browser, return to my orders page. Let's click on an order. There you go. So I'm now able to see the individual items that were purchased with the quantity and the total amount and the order ID. Okay, now finally, the last thing that we need to do to finish off our order history components is just come back over to the text editor, and on my order details component at the top of the file, I need to import something from React Redux, which is the use dispatch hook, and I need to import a action from my orders actions. So I can come in here, go to redux/orders/orders actions, and I need to import set order details. And then to get access to dispatch at the top here, I'm going to set const dispatch equals use dispatch and call that hook. And I need to also import the use effect hook. So use effect, and we can call that hook here. So we'll just say use effect, right? We only want it to run once, so we'll pass in an empty dependency array. But I'm actually not going to put the code here immediately. I need to have a return here, right? And this will be called when the component unmounts, which is exactly when I want to dispatch my action, which is the set order details action. And we're just going to pass in an empty object. Now the reason that we do this is that whenever you navigate away from this page, what we're going to do is we're going to clear our order details state so that you don't persist that throughout your application, which can create some UI user experience issues. So this is just best practice just to clear that, because if you return to this page, you will need to fetch it again. So that should be quite straightforward. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial. As you can see, the users are now able to view their order history and order details. Now, before I sign off, I just want to remind you guys that at the end of these tutorials, I do create pull requests and I merge into the official GitHub repository for this project. I will be posting a direct link in the description of this video, so please do go and check it out. I also want to encourage you guys to check out my official YouTube channel, not only to find my other videos, but also to find the official playlist for this series, which again, I'm going to be posting a direct link to in the description of this video. But most importantly of all, please do like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on those notifications. Thank you very much for following this tutorial, and I'll catch you in the next one.